Hundreds of millions of Europeans have voted to select 720 members of the European Parliament, and rising support for the far right has prompted the resignation of the Belgian Prime Minister and early elections in France. But what does it mean for the rest of the world? This is the second episode of the EU election results, looking at its implications for beyond Europe. I'm Erdem Koch.
And I'm Ozan Ibrahim.
Welcome to Put Simply. In the first episode of this two-part series, we spoke to Guglielmo Picci, a former member of the Italian Parliament and Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister, who analysed the results for us. In this second part, we speak to Chris Humphrey. Chris is the Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council based in Singapore. He's our guest this week here on Put Simply. Chris, welcome to Put Simply. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yes, certainly. So I'm Chris Humphrey. I'm the Executive Director at the EU-ASEAN Business Council based out of Singapore. We are a membership organisation representing the interests of European businesses. That's Europe in a very broad sense, not just the EU. We do advocacy work. We help to promote improving and better environments for trade and investment on behalf of our members. That's both within Southeast Asia, so working closely with all the governments across the region, and also with the European Commission out of Brussels as well, to try and put in place more friendly trade policies and trade agreements to help boost the trade and investment relationship.
As someone who works very closely with the European Union, how do you view the results of the parliamentary elections?
I think in general, with the slight move to the right in the Parliament, we will hopefully see a European Parliament which is a bit more business friendly, and particularly when it comes to the external facing policies, directives and regulations coming out from the Parliament going forward, we would hope to see that they are a lot more collaborative, perhaps is probably the best word, with the EU's external partners, less combative, less difficult for partners to accept and deal with, which in return will help boost the trading relationship as well. So if you think over recent years, particularly the EU's Green Deal, whilst I think most of us can accept the objectives behind it, the way it has been received by the EU's partners around the world has left a lot to be desired. And unfortunately, it's often businesses that bear the brunt of that.
Chris, you spent a lot of time dealing with various different trade issues and investment issues, as you mentioned. But how do you see the election results broadly for the future of the EU?
I think if they'd gone too far to the right, and we have seen the rise of the right, extreme right in some cases, it would have been actually a more challenging 5 years ahead for European unity, perhaps a watering down by some of European principles and the idea of the European Union. And that would not have been helpful, I think, going forward. It is clear that when Europe is united, it is much stronger, both internally and then in its external relations and dealings as well. I think what we've ended up with as a result is, the centre ground has held itself together largely. You saw a weakening of the Greens. You saw a weakening of some of the more left-leaning parties. There was an increase, of course, in some of the more extreme right-wing parties. And if they hold sway when it comes to close votes, you might see an increase in economic nationalism coming out from the EU. That would not benefit anybody, particularly European citizens, and certainly not European businesses.
You mentioned the results being more pro-business as it currently stands. How is the European business community responding to these elections?
Well, I think at the moment, it's a bit of a wait and see what happens. We need to wait for the Parliament to have its first sitting in the middle of July, see how that pans out in terms of the allocations of roles within the committees in the Parliament, who ends up being President of the Parliament as well. That's quite a powerful position. The key thing, looking ahead though, is how the new Parliament will deal with the nominations for the new College of Commissioners. Because after all, at the end of the day, it's the European Commission itself that sets a lot of the policy and direction. So whilst the Parliament may come forward with legislation, we'll need to approve anything that the Commission comes up with. It's how that Commission is going to be formed and the College of Commissioners. And there will be changes in the College of Commissioners, and we know that because some of the countries who who appoint their commissioners. Have had changes of government in recent times since the last college was formed. Some commissioners will stand down, some will be nominated and probably won't get approved by the Parliament. So a lot depends about the Parliament itself when it has its first sitting, how it divides itself up, how we see the various coalitions forming within the Parliament. And of course, one of their first and key decisions will be who to appoint as President of the European Commission.
You spend a lot of time talking to and working with various ASEAN governments across all levels, and also the ASEAN Secretariat as well. But also, I know you speak to many different governments from around the world as part of your job. Have you had any indication as to how this election result is being received, and how would you expect it to be received by the different governments that you deal with?
I'm pretty sure here in Southeast Asia, there's a hope, maybe an expectation, that there's some softening of some of the elements of the Green Deal going forward. No one believes the Green Deal will disappear, but how it is implemented and to what degree it is implemented is probably up for debate now with the formation of the current Parliament, and how it will take a look going forward, and indeed maybe changes in the College of Commissioners as well. And I think that is something that certainly governments here, Malaysia, Indonesia in particular, will be looking out for. They're probably hoping that some of the elements of the Green Deal, the ones they object to the most, will get softened, although they won't go away. And therefore, the governments may well welcome it. We have seen, to be fair, we've seen in the last 18 to 24 months a bit of an uptick in engagement from the European Union, both from the parliamentarians and from the Commission, in engagement with Southeast Asia. There's been a lot more visits coming into the region. There's been a lot more discussion and engagement on things like deforestation directive. A bit late in the day, but it has started to happen, and that's helped to ease things. I would hope, with the way the Parliament is looking to take shape, that will continue and maybe even increase further.
Chris, your work with the Chamber involves covering different policy areas on behalf of your members. What are some of the priorities for the Chamber in ASEAN, and how do you particularly see the EU elections impacting the work that you do?
Well, I guess our number one priority is always going to be to try and see more free trade agreements between the EU and ASEAN member states, and then eventually one day perhaps a region-to-region deal. Now, we've seen in very recent times the recommencement discussions with Thailand and with the Philippines. We may see it with Malaysia, although I think that requires movement by the Malaysians rather than by Europe. And we have ongoing discussions with Indonesia with a very narrow window to try and close the discussions off. And that last one may be helped by the formation of the new Parliament, because the way that it's looking now, some of the concerns that people had before may be dissipated slightly. And I think in the case of Indonesia, there is a realization amongst many MEPs that a rough diamond is better than no diamond at all. But the other areas where work needs to be accelerated and perhaps deepened is on things like climate action, climate change, environmental policies, working with ASEAN on areas like energy transition, working on things like developing circularity principles with ASEAN as well. And on top of all of that, digital environment, digital economy issues, where Europe, I think, needs to do a lot more work than it has been with ASEAN. It doesn't mean it hasn't done anything, because there has been stuff, but ramping that engagement up is important for both sides. Europe wants to be seen as a good partner of ASEAN. Europe needs ASEAN as a partner for a variety of reasons, not just trade and investment, but geopolitical reasons as well. And ASEAN, I think, wants to see Europe do a lot more with it going forward. The Parliament, the way it's looking like, I would hope, would be one that will look to engage more with external partners, including Southeast Asia.
Chris, you mentioned the Green Deal. Could you drill a little bit further into some of the policy areas where you expect to see some distinct differences in approach by the new EU Parliament, and particularly how these differences in approach are likely to impact ASEAN overall, but also other regions as well? I mean, particularly how the EU will be dealing with other parts of the world.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you look towards the fag end of the old European Parliament, you think you already saw signs of a softening of the attitudes on the Green Deal, the concessions that are being made, for instance, to European farmers on things like minimum residual levels of pesticides on their products, the attitude on fertilizers as well. And I think you're going to see that translate more going forward with the way the new parliament looks like it's going to be taking shape. So whilst I don't believe the Green Deal is going to go away, and the intentions and the objectives behind it certainly won't go away, what I think you'll see is how it is being implemented and how rigidly it will be implemented could be eased, because I think we're going to end up with a parliament now which is going to be a bit more business friendly, if you like, and will recognise more that some of the compliance costs involved in elements of the Green Deal are large and not insignificant, and eventually actually harm European businesses, and indeed will harm European external facing connections to the rest of the world as well. So on things like the deforestation directive, you may see a pushing out of some of the timelines. You may see a lot more help being offered for partners with compliance. Hopefully you'll see the EU being more prepared to recognise sustainability practices being exercised elsewhere in the world, like in Malaysia, for instance, on palm oil. But I think overall, it's the timelines and the requirements for compliance, I think, is where we're going to see some movement. The other area might be a little bit more flexibility when it comes to free trade negotiations. So the current Commission has been quite rigid in what it expects in FTAs. A lot of stuff's been added into FTAs that many people would say were non-core trade issues or non-core investment issues, such as human rights, labour rights, requirements to sign up and confirm you'll meet your Paris agreement commitments. I think you might see some of those not disappear, but maybe a little bit more loosely applied going forward. And that would help when it comes to negotiating FTA agreements.
As a bit of a follow-up to that, obviously there's been some media commentary around a leaning towards a more far-right parties having a little bit more say. There've been some talk about maybe some changes to immigration laws and the EU's attitude towards immigration. How would you see that impacting the business sector, but also where EU is standing in places like ASEAN or in other parts of the world?
Well, I think if the far-right parties end up holding too much sway, you will see a rise of European economic nationalism. So doing more things to what they would say protect European industry. I think if you see the reaction from the German automotive industry today on the Commission imposing penal tariffs on Chinese EVs, you will see that European industry doesn't always think in the same way. Imposing penal tariffs on another partner doesn't necessarily actually do much to help your own industry. All it does is raise costs for your consumers. But I think if the right wing holds more sway, you will see attempts to clamp down on immigration into the EU. You can have a view on that. Does it protect Europeans for jobs, or does it mean that you're going to miss out on getting skilled workers that you need in certain sectors? Personally, I would lean to the latter, not the former. But that's a personal view. But you'd also then see them, I think, coming forward with more measures to supposedly protect European industry from external competition, rather than doing what we should be doing, of course, which is trying to make sure our industry is more competitive by supporting it more, by giving it more help, by working more to try and develop R&D strategies, etc.
Let's take a helicopter view here for a second, Chris, to sum up. How do you see the challenges and the opportunities with this new parliament?
I think the main challenges will be, first of all, for businesses getting to know any new cohorts of MEPs that come in, understand what their desires are. You will see major changes in some of the committees. So, from my point of view, changes on DASE, which is the Committee for Southeast Asia, or on INTA, the International Trade Committee, they will be quite key to look out for. See who comes in, see how active they are, what keen interest they take, and try and understand them a bit more, because those for us are key parliamentary committees. If I was looking at a very much a helicopter view of the parliament, things I'd be looking out for are any initial motions or debates on international trade, on geopolitics and the EU forming closer relations with external partners, which I think in the light of things like COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukraine war are key things for Europe. Europe needs to be forming more friends around the world and perhaps be taking a more external looking view, but in doing so, making sure that it does it in a more collaborative way than it's been doing previously.
Chris, you regularly meet with the various commissioners and obviously parliamentarians from the EU. When you see them next, what type of advice are you going to give them in terms of what they can do in their next term to boost European businesses and trade between EU and obviously ASEAN, but also the rest of the world?
Yeah, well, particularly from my point of view with ASEAN, it would be to drive ahead more with the free trade agreements that they're currently working on, push them over the line as fast as possible, which probably means giving officials in DG Trade a bit more bandwidth and some more resources to work with. It will mean having a lot more constructive dialogue with ASEAN and other regional players, particularly in areas like energy transition, development of circularity concepts, connectivity issues, get existing European projects that are running in the region functioning properly and up and running properly, because some of them are stalling a bit. But it is really, how can I put this without offending your viewers? Get your ass over to Southeast Asia. Get the senior people over. Come and meet them. People in this part of the world want to see people. They want to see them in person and shake their hands and have discussions with them. And you should come with open minds, not coming thinking, I'm only going to come if there's an agreement to be signed or something positive to say. Sometimes you just need to come and have the conversation for the sake of having a conversation, and that will go a long way. If we have new commissioners, if we have new MEPs, or there are changes in leadership in some of those committees inside the Parliament, the new committee heads need to come out, need to go around the world, they need to meet their counterparts, and need to listen and understand.
Well, it's taken a 16 episode to change our rating from clean to explicit now. So that's thank you for that, Chris. We're very grateful. But thank you very much for your time and your insights. You've raised some very, very interesting points, and we hope to get you back maybe after you have had your first meeting and let us know how it went.
I'd love to do so. Thank you, gentlemen.
And that's been this week's episode of Put Simply. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn at Oroka Group to stay up to date with all the latest episodes and news. Feel free to leave a comment and suggestions on what you'd like to see featured on the podcast as well. Until next time, I'm Erdem Koch.
And I'm Ozan Ibrahim.
Thanks for listening.